Hello, changelings, and welcome to the Night Garden. I'm VampireAntihero, and this is Conquer Thy Fear Studio. Hello, YouTube. This is future me. Past me, obviously, as you're watching this, but future me from the content that you're about to watch. I just wanted to preface this with this was actually made as a Skillshare class. I wound up having some issues with the platform. They told me that I hadn't recorded in 1080p. They actually said that I hadn't recorded in 720p, which my camera is 1080. So I can't do anything on Skillshare unless I wind up upgrading my camera, and I don't have the money to do that right now. So you guys are getting this for free. I'm going to follow up this video with some other stuff. There may be some references to a class project or follow along. Because this is all the content that I made for Skillshare. I didn't change anything of it before uploading it, except for just compiling it into one long video. If you want to do a class project, go for it. I'm not going to, expect anybody to submit anything or anything like that. But if you want to follow along, go for it. I do have the PDF available. It's going to be linked in the description down below. So if that's something that you find helpful for you, then go for it. Also, I would appreciate it if you would consider donating. This was something that I had done to kind of create a passive income for myself. If not, that's totally fine too. But if you like what I do, you can check me out at coffee.com/VampireAntihero. That's where I take my donations. So I hope that this is helpful for you and that you all enjoy the content. I made this with true beginners in mind, people who haven't really started drawing. And without further ado, let's head into the video. Just a quick note before we get started. This class is only talking about the most basic concepts that fall under each fundamental that we're going to cover. There are definitely more advanced theories when discussing most of the fundamentals, especially when talking about form, value, and color, but you need to understand the most basic principles before moving on to the more nuanced things under each building block. Because of that, we'll only be working with the most basic building blocks for now. One of the most important things about art is the mindset that you hold when you start your journey. So before we even pick up our pens, let's talk about that a little bit. Let's start with how we approach our journey. The way that I approach it is looking at drawing as if it's like a language. But what does that mean? First, think of a baby. How do they communicate? Well, at first the only thing that they can do is cry or babble. Then those babbles start to mimic what is around them to form simple words. As they grow, they start connecting those words to things that they want to express. After that, they move on to small sentences that sometimes use the wrong words or grammar structures. But eventually, our baby hits a point where they are both older and more experienced with their speech. This is an example of a child using the fundamentals of sound and rules of their language to become fluent speakers. Now, I want you to think about how it feels to learn a new language. When you're fluent in one language and you sit down to learn another, it can be extremely overwhelming. There are different grammar structures to learn, different words that mean different things. We're talking about different concepts that don't belong in our native languages. We're talking about different characters that change the meaning of words. We're talking about different words that mean different groups of people that don't exist in my native language. It feels silly to start with sounds, but you also can't get your point across with regular words and communication because you don't know them yet. Art is the same way. Beginning artists typically try to jump into drawing by taking some complicated idea that they want to get down onto paper and trying to put it down without the knowledge of the grammar structures or the basic sounds, so to speak. You see this all the time with children's drawings, but also with people of any age who hasn't really tried to draw anything before. A lot of the time, beginning artists stick with iconography or lines to get the point across. Think of a house being a box with an arrow attached or a head being a circle. When you start learning the fundamentals of the drawing process, then you're learning your communication tools. Shape and form are your simple sounds and syllables. Lines are your words. Value and color are your basic sentence structures and your grammar. And when you first learn the fundamentals of art, you're learning a visual vocabulary that will get your communication and your point across. This will give you the ability to communicate your ideas more clearly. There are nuances that you learn throughout your artistic growth, extra things that add rules on top of the fundamentals so that you can communicate more effectively. But ultimately, the basic structure is there. It is very important to not get discouraged with your progress. If your drawing doesn't quite look like how you pictured it, you're still building towards that goal. It's natural to get frustrated at times. That means you're capable of improvement and building these skills to match your vision. You will get there with practice. When we first start speaking, our words are unpolished. They're very difficult for other people to understand. It sounds like we're trying to talk with marbles in our mouths. As we get better at speaking, our tongue remembers where to place itself in our mouths. As we get better at shape and line, our hand remembers how hard or gentle to press, how quick or slow to move. And we start to learn and notice how our bodies can do things easier to make our jobs easier. For example, for me, I find it easiest to pull towards my body when I'm drawing instead of pushing away. Now, as I'm drawing, I flip my canvas or my paper so that my hand orientation gives me the quickest and most confident pull of a line. I have the best control over my motion, and I have the best effect for what I'm looking for in my drawing. There is no shortcuts. Learning the basics will set us on the path to fluent communication through our own visions and worlds. So now that we have that covered, let's move on to the basics. The next things that we are going to cover are shape and form. If you're looking at art as a language, then shape is your basic sounds and form are your syllables. You can make anything convincingly if you understand how shape and form work. Pretty much every type of drawing is built up by a simple shape or a combination of simple shapes. Every single thing that you can draw is made up of the same building blocks. A triangle, a circle or an oval, a rectangle, a diamond, or a square. The problem with shapes is that they are two-dimensional. We're trying to represent a three-dimensional thing in a two-dimensional plane. This is where form comes in. When you're talking about form, you're talking about stacking shapes to simulate depth. This makes the two-dimensional shapes appear to exist in a three-dimensional world. You can twist or warp the forms to fit what you need, but at their extreme basics, they break down into three categories. Some examples of that would be a pyramid, a sphere, a block, a cylinder, or a cube. All of these things can be combined or broken down to make solid building blocks of our drawings, sculptures, and paintings. Let's look at this with some examples. Most of the time when someone starts drawing, they have a goal in mind. Those goals can be broken down into three categories. People are characters, animals, and buildings or environments. First, let's look at people. Take this drawing mannequin, for instance. We can see several shapes and forms standing out that we wouldn't normally think about when we look at an actual person. Spheres are at each joint. The arms and legs are cylinders. The chest and hips are a pyramid and a rectangle, respectively. They're kind of rounded, but they're about there. The whole human form is a big task to cover, so let's start with something a little bit more direct. Some of the hardest things to draw on the human body are faces and hands, so let's look at a hand and a nose to find the basic shapes. These shapes won't be our final drawings, just a guide for us to follow later. Think of the shapes as the skeleton of your drawing. When you look at a nose, it can be tempting to try and make the shapes of the shadows as the shape of the nose, but that tends to look like a W on the face. So how do we break something down into basic shapes? The easiest way is to look at a reference, and we'll be talking a little bit more about that later. Really study the picture that you have in front of you and think about what shapes it reminds you of. The way that people break things down is different for everyone, but for me, a nose is a circle, a diamond, and a triangle. As you can see, these shapes are actually overlapping and stacked on top of one another to give us the complex form of the nose. As for a hand, what shapes do you see when you look at it? For me, a hand at rest breaks down to a square, a triangle, and 14 cylinders. What makes hands difficult is how mobile they are, so these shapes can change, but this is a basic concept. Moving away from the human form, let's take a look at an animal. Take a moment to study this picture of a cat and think about what shapes you see. If you want to pause briefly, go ahead. This is mine. How does that compare to what you saw? Did you spot shapes that I might have interpreted differently? Again, people see things in multiple ways, and there's no one correct answer. Now, on to environments. Man-made structures like buildings almost always break down to a series of rectangles with a lot of symmetry, whereas organic structures like trees and rocks barely have any symmetry or hard edges. This is slightly edging into the realm of shape variation and shape language though, so that's something we'll leave for another time. Shapes are the building blocks of what we're going to make. Now that we have a basic idea of how shapes and forms work within drawing, let's move on to line. If we continue with the language metaphor, then lines are what turn our babbles and syllables into cohesive words. Lines are interesting because they're there whether we intentionally put them there or not. We see lines everywhere, whether they are a line that's drawn by us or something that is implied by a shift in color, a break within a form, or otherwise. Here are some of the different kind of lines that exist: contour lines and implied lines. A contour line is what it sounds like, a line going around the outside of an object. You'll sometimes see artists practice in beginners classes with the contour line drawing. That's a drawing in which you don't pick up your drawing implement and make an image using only that one line to signify the edges of the objects. Implied lines are lines that our eyes and brains create as a result of information given. This can be due to a difference in value or color, or a break in a drawn line. Lines in general give us a lot of information with very little. For example, a thicker, heavier line will give us the illusion that something is heavy or it's in the darkest, deepest shadow. A thicker line can also signify something that is closer to us in our field of view. Meanwhile, a fine, lighter line can signify brightness, weightlessness, or distance. You can layer lines to create the illusion of shadow, or you can use lines to signify movement. These are the more advanced things that you can do with line and are largely based on stylistic choices, but the important takeaway is that line gives us meaning to our shapes. With that in mind, I'm going to ink our nose, hand, and cat here. Let's start with the nose. In the last lesson, I mentioned how different shapes can be stacked to create a singular complex form. That's how we'll look at our nose here. It's important to pay attention where our deepest shadows fall and our lightest lights. You can see that the darkest shadows fall under the tip of the nose and off to the sides. Where you put your line defines your forms, and for nose, I find that adding parentheses to the sides of the diamonds and a U at the bottom of the nose circle make the most effective representation. In other styles such as anime, you'll sometimes see no nose at all from the front, or you'll see small lines where the nostrils would be. Moving on to the hand, let's make sure that we pay attention to where the weight is hitting and where our darkest darks are. Everything has weight because the world has gravity. When we look at our hand shape here, let's imagine a table underneath. Our thickest lines are going to be where the hand connects to the table, which is both where our darkest shadows will be and where our weight is resting. And now, onto the cat. tell me why I made the line decisions that I did here? What about the lines make sense? Each decision that I made for the cat is based on personal stylistic choices, but they're following the same idea of heavy lines showing the most weight in darkness, and lighter lines being in the light and not weighed down by gravity. All in all, you can make a full image with shape, form, and line. After all, a single word can be a sentence. If line is our polished word in the art language, then color and value are our vocabulary and the ability to form basic sentences. I've lumped value and color together because they play well with each other and are similar in concept, even if they're two separate points. Color on its own is a great deal more complicated, and I can teach an entire class on color theory, but I'll try to break it down to its simplest form here. If we look at value and color, we can think about both as a series of scales. I'll explain that first with value. The reason we're starting with value is because, as a theory, value is under the umbrella of color, but it's also its own individual thing. Value is one of the simplest aspects about color, mainly because we're talking about light instead. And that's not like the difference between maroon and bright red, for example. Value is the scale that we're talking about when we're talking about how light or dark something is. In a typical beginner's art class, you'll usually see artists making bars that go from black to white with different strengths of lead pencils to show a value scale, but it essentially looks like this: black, white, and a series of gray in between. Color, on the other hand, can be extremely complicated. After all, there are millions of colors. If value is considered how light or dark something is on one scale, then how does that affect color? Well, it really doesn't. Color has its own separate scales, and these scales are called saturation and hue. Saturation talks about the intensity of the color that we are using, and hue is telling us what color we are dealing with. So let's start with hue. When we talk about hue, we're asking where we fall in the color spectrum. The basic color names, blue, red, green, yellow, these are all hues. Typically, you'll see artists referring to a color wheel, which is basically a rainbow set up in a wheel, sometimes with light radiating inward and dark radiating outwards. In digital drawing programs, it looks like a thin circle of bright rainbow colors with a square or a triangle inside. The circle, or the brightest, most saturated colors, are your hue. Looking at the color wheel can show us how different colors relate in terms of design. We'll come back to that in a moment. Much like value, saturation is another simple scale. But instead of picturing a scale from black to white, picture something more like this: a pure hue at one end and a colorless gray at the other. Saturation is saying how pure or intense a color is. Something with deep saturation would be as close to the pure hue as it can be, whereas something that's desaturated will appear more gray. When you're dealing with saturation in terms of value, then replace the gray with a white or a black. The white with a certain amount of color is going to be a tint, whereas the black with a certain amount of color will be a shade. We talk about different shades of color all the time. For example, pink, as we picture it, is actually a tint of red and not a pure color at all. Pastels are all tints, where jewel tones are all shades. Looking at how different colors relate can be a very powerful way to color. We won't go too far into this, just the basic, but the color wheel can be broken down in different ways. Primary colors are the three main colors that we can use that will mix to form other colors. Most of us have learned these as red, yellow, and blue. It's different in digital scales: cyan, yellow, magenta, and black, but that has more to do with the printing process, and we'll skip over that. If we think of red, yellow, and blue as our primary colors, then orange, green, and violet are secondary colors. You mix red and yellow to get orange, blue and yellow to get green, and blue and red to get violet. Simple enough, right? But these aren't the only colors that exist. What about when you mix a violet with a red, for example? Well, that gives you what we call tertiary colors. A tertiary color is just a secondary color mixed with a primary color. Now that we know how to make these colors, we can look at the color wheel and cut it in half. We'll cut it in between red and violet and yellow and green. The half from red to yellow is bright and intense, right? These are called warm colors, whereas the other half of the wheel reads as darker and calmer. These are called cool colors. Colors make us feel different things, and depending on what we want our viewers to feel, we can choose to color our work in a certain type of way. We can talk about color schemes when we talk about this as well. Monochromatic colors are all colors that exist in the same family, in tints and shades of the same hue. Colors opposite on the color wheel are complementary colors, and they make each other pop. Coincidentally, when mixing complementary colors together, you end up with a muddy brown. Analogous colors are next to each other on the color wheel, and triads are three hue families that are equally positioned on the color wheel. The three scales, hue, saturation, and value, work together to give us a simple understanding of color. Now, when we apply this to our own work, it can quickly get overwhelming. That is because of how color looks and works within our eyes. Even when breaking color down to its simplest form, we can have trouble making color choices. This next point that I'll make goes into color relativity, which is a bit more of an advanced concept, but at its most basic, it has to do with complementary colors and how our eyes read those colors. When you're coloring and you want someone's skin to look like it's in shadow, for example, you would add a little bit of a bluish tint to your color, which would make it brown overall. This is because skin tones usually read as orangish if it's a more pale skin tone, or reddish if it's a darker skin tone. This increases the saturation while decreasing the value. Complicated, right? Now that we understand how color and value work, let's put this into practice. To keep things simple, I'll stick to a cell shading style for the coloring of our nose, hand, and cat. This will make it so that I can show these things in action. For the nose, to show value, I'll stick to black and white. Our darker shadows will stick in the lower grays, whereas our lightest highlights will stick to our upper grays, but you never want to go fully black or white when you're shading, especially with skin. This footage is sped up, but the whole process only took me about 5 minutes. For a hand, I'll stick with simple color and show how adding blue to a color will pull it down in value and up the saturation. The colors that I picked for our hand here, in terms of the shadow and highlight, are pretty intense, and I'm first laying them over top without blending them at all, so you can see what I'm talking about when I say adding blue to a shadow or adding yellow to a highlight. This is easier to show digitally than it is on traditional media. If you were to use like colored pencils or something, you would add a darker brown with a blue tone, which you can see by holding your pencils next to each other, and one will look warmer and one will look cooler, for example. If you're using something that layers well, like watercolor, then you can add blue on top of whatever your base tone is, and that will add your shadow. Again, this was sped up, but it only took me about 10 minutes from start to finish. So here we are before I blend my shadow and highlight colors into my local base color. And here we are after. We'll do the cat with the same simple coloring, but just to show how the colors move on something that's not skin tone. There are more complicated things that go into color and coloring, like ambient occlusion and color relativity, but these are more advanced topics and for another class. The cat is originally an orangish kind of strawberry blonde color, and I wanted to do something a little bit less skin tone-ish for the cat, so just for fun, I made them a cool tone. You'll see me experimenting with that here. This also only took me about 5 to 10 minutes. Perspective, anatomy, and proportion are all technically fundamentals of art. However, they are incredibly hard concepts to nail down for someone who's just starting out. There are whole courses dedicated to anatomy alone. If you're using references and practicing your shapes and forms, then these 3 concepts are things that you'll pick up naturally. So you can have some context, I'll give you the general idea of these 3 topics. That way you can start solidifying your fundamentals before you dive headfirst into them. You can think of perspective as a grid on the floor. The grid shows us how far an object is from our field of view. Depending on how far away it is, it tells us how much detail to add or how to throw our shading into the mix, and what might eventually block or show portions of an object. Anatomy is specific to characters, whether that be human, monster, or animal, but it's talking about the parts of the character, how they move, what makes them move that way, and where certain things can or cannot be exaggerated in a design. That last part ties directly into proportion. Proportion is talking about how big something is in relation to something else. When you're learning character design, you usually see people use their head as a reference for portions of the rest of the body. For example, if I place my hand in front of my face like this, then my hand is roughly proportionate to the size of my face, or roughly 2/3 of my head. So if I were to do a self-portrait, I would want to make sure that the hands weren't too big, and I would do that based on how big I drew my head. Again, these are the simplest descriptions of each topic, and I could really go into depth for each one, but since we're sticking to the basics and these kind of get picked up naturally, let's move on. Let's launch into why references are important. When you are an artist, you draw from something called your visual library. Every artist has one, and every artist's visual library is different based on what they've experienced and what they've seen throughout their lives. This is your internal visual library. However, it's impossible for most people to gain an intensive internal visual library large enough to be able to draw anything from imagination. This is where references become important. Sure, there are outliers like Kim Jong-gi, but for most people, you need references in order to learn and to grow. For everything that we can't quite picture in our heads, references give us a starting point to jump off of. When you're learning and starting to expand your internal visual library, being able to look at things and really break them down to understand how they're built and what makes them work is priceless. You see, a lot of traditional art education programs include life drawing for this reason. The idea isn't to copy or trace the reference, but rather to study it and try to break it down to understand how its basic shapes build what is the complex form, like what we're doing in our class project. If you're interested in drawing people, then life drawing is far better than using still images because you can take the time to really see how things twist and turn, how muscles react to movement, and what creates different shapes within the body based on how weight is displaced, balance, and body type. However, any reference will help you figure out how to place shapes and create a compelling composition that shows more confidence than if you were to try without. There are plenty of resources to find poses out there on the web in order to practice. One that I've used for a long time is a Dorka stock, previously known as Senshi stock. My personal favorite resource to use while practicing is lineofaction.com, because you can set the references to shift on an automatic timer, kind of like a traditional drawing class where a model changes their pose. When you get more confident with the fundamentals, you can use different references to create character designs that don't exist in a real space. As you build your internal library, you can figure out how shapes can stack to create fantastical things, or even practical things like buildings or statues that don't exist. For example, this is one fun piece that I did live based on a prompt without visual references. When I approach a larger piece or something that I'm doing for a client, one of the first things that I do is start by compiling a mood board. This is so that I can keep in mind what kind of styles, textures, colors, and visuals I want to include in the piece. It helps me develop my ideas faster, and ultimately makes the piece come across as stronger and more confident. That being said, I think it now may be time to bring this chat to a close. Now that we know all the basics, let's put it into practice. So there we have it. Now that you have a solid understanding of the fundamentals, I hope that you're motivated and inspired to try drawing and work on honing those skills. If you need some references for the class project, the ones that I took are provided in the class materials section, along with a PDF with some of the definitions and tips from the course. If you found this class helpful, I'd appreciate it if you left me a review and feedback below. If you like my teaching style and would like to see more of me, then don't forget to follow me here. I plan on releasing more courses soon. If you have any questions, feel free to leave a comment or message me. I'm happy to elaborate on anything that I've shared here today. If you'd like to keep up with some of my other projects, you can find my website at conquerthyfear.com. I keep the site regularly updated with news and events, and I post on YouTube every other Friday and stream on Twitch every Tuesday, Wednesday, and Friday. You can also find me on Twitter, Tumblr, and ArtStation. Thank you for letting me teach you today. And as always, drink your water, have fun, and do what you can. Have a great day, everyone. Bye-bye.